Welcome to a special interview. I'm Vincent Franchini from Tumblar House, here with author Roger Thomas. Hi, Roger. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Excellent.
So we had a very fun interview on your novel Under the Watchful Sky last time. Today we're going to be talking about your other published novel, or novel published by Tumblar House, From Afar. From Afar.
Yep.
What's From Afar about, Roger?
Well, From Afar is a long-held dream of mine to write a novel of the story of the Magi from St. Matthew's Gospel. We know the account in Scripture. It's very brief. There's been a lot of legend embellished around it, including the number of the Magi, even their names. Their camels, that's not part of the original story. Actually, in Europe, the Magi are a much bigger thing than they are here. In Europe, for instance, in Spain and such, you don't get visited by Santa Claus. You get visited by the three kings. They're the ones who bring the gifts. So they loom large in legend, but there's not a whole lot of detail about them, and it will always be that way. But it gives a writer's imagination scope, so you can fill in some details and have some fun. And there were other reasons I wrote that one as well, but that's the framework.
Okay. Yeah, so this book is, I guess you could consider it historical fiction.
Yes.
Now this has been a genre that I've always been very leery of. I'm really sensitive on it because it feels like there's license to diverge significantly from historical accounts. Like there's no responsibility. Like people don't judge it based on its historical accuracy. I mean, there's a lot of movies out there. I won't watch a bunch of movies because I know they engage in a sort of historical revisionism, and I can't stomach that. What's your approach to historical fiction?
Well, I mean, you're very wise to be leery because there is a lot of that going on. A lot of people think, well, I can tell this story, I can give you a picture of this history better than the original people do.
Yeah.
My approach if I'm writing history, for one thing, I want to make it to be very true to what is known about the events. There's a lot of what Lewis called chronological snobbery kicking around in the modern times. The idea that everybody before us was just too stupid and they didn't know anything, and therefore we enlightened ones have to come along and set the record straight. Well, that's just folly. People of old times knew how to write history. They didn't always write it the way we moderns like our history. We like nice chronological sequence with all the details filled in. But that's a modern affectation. A lot of ancient writers would not write like that, but that did not mean they were not writing historically accurate details. So when I'm writing historical fiction, particularly if I'm touching on the scriptures, it's extremely important to me to stay true to as many details as are known. Now, with the story of the Magi, that's a tough one because there just aren't a whole lot of details. But what details we have in Matthew's Gospel and how they dovetail with other aspects of the salvation story are very important to keep straight. So that was job one with that book, was making sure that I had the details filled out in such a way that they respected and reflected the scriptural account, such as it is. But there's another aspect, even more so than the question of actually revising the events of history, and that is that one of the challenges to writing accurate historical fiction is to try and convey the ways of thinking of the people of that time. There's a fair amount of scriptural fiction, particularly in evangelical circles, that often ends up kind of being disappointing because even if the person's a good storyteller, they can't break free of the mindset of the time they live in. They're postmodern Westerners, and they think like postmodern Westerners, and they'll write a story about David and Goliath or whatever it might be. They just project postmodern Western thought back into that time. And it takes a bit of work to realize that people of different times and places thought differently, and they looked at the world differently than we do. I remember taking a course in Shakespeare in college, and the instructor had one of the first books he had us read was a little thin volume called The Elizabethan World View. which was a brief primer in how Elizabethan people thought. The various heliocentric or earth-centered universe, the spheres of heaven, all that kind of thing. And so in order to understand Shakespeare properly, our instructor, I think, wisely thought, you need to learn how Shakespearean thought. So casting back to the Magi, and well, it's more that period of time, that was the Hellenistic period. That was a period after the Greeks had risen up and conquered pretty much all the East. They conquered the Persians. This is Alexander the Great. They conquered Egypt. They conquered the Holy Land. They conquered Persia, all the way out to the edge of India, where they finally stopped. And the culture that followed was called the Hellenistic culture, and it actually endured through well into Roman times. In fact, the Roman culture, it's called Greco-Roman for a reason. The Romans were the military people, but by and large, they adopted the Greek Hellenistic culture. And that was a period. I've got thick volumes on my shelf about the Hellenistic period and how they thought. It's important to know that period because that's when the incarnation happened. That's when Jesus came. It was right in the middle of the Hellenistic period. And a lot of the struggles in the New Testament, and especially when you get into like Paul's travels, are him working in the Hellenistic world. And that was one place I saw a real opportunity to go beyond just conveying an interesting story about the Magi. Because the Hellenistic world of the first century AD is very much like our world, or to put it another way, our world is very much like theirs. In this sense, it's a very anthropocentric. It's centered on man, not God. Centered on the works of men, the words of men, the deeds of men. Back in those times, they were very religious, but the gods were minor characters. They were inscrutable. You couldn't understand them. They were capricious. And, truth be told, it was more important what the Romans were doing than what the gods were doing. It was a world very much centered around the works of human beings. And in our day, we're a very similar kind of way. God has been dismissed. People worship many gods, if you want to think of it that. They worship the works of their hands, their careers, their political parties, their ideologies, whatever it might be. And the one true God has been kind of shoved to the side as being irrelevant. And so that was the framework from which I approached the story of the Magi, that these would have been men of their time, and they would have had these attitudes, and they would have been looking for truth in different ways. And so those were the big questions driving the story of From Afar. How can I bring these people to life and convey why were they looking for the King of the Jews? What was so important to them? And what did they actually find?
Ooh, okay, this is a tough interview because after what you just said, my mind is pulled in 50 different directions because there's so much to talk. Okay.
I'll give shorter answers. Okay.
No, I mean, that was great. That was great. I hope I can keep every direction in my mind because I want to touch on so many different things from what you just said. Now, yeah, you talked about like the worldview, and one of my favorite things in the book, because the Three Magi, if I remember correctly, they're from somewhere in Persia, right?
Well, they originally, I kind of hewed a little bit to the custom here because in Catholic tradition, they come from three different areas. Persia, one of them, that would be Melchior. Balthazar comes from Arabia. And Gaspar is an interesting one because in some traditions he comes actually from India. Other traditions he comes from the area of Armenia, the Caucasus Mountains. And so I chose to have him be from India. But they do meet in Persia because the way the story goes, Melchior kept a school and the other two were students at that school through the years. And so they meet there together. And that's where the story begins.
Yes. So they're not Jewish, they're not Christian. You have this different interesting perspective on the world. And right. Your research sort of came across in terms of their worldview because, when they're thinking about the Jews, they're elucidating on the Jews, they Jewish beliefs are pretty normal to us, you know, but to the
Right.
Persians, it's very different because, as you said, as you alluded to, the monotheistic, or not mono, excuse me, you know, how every other culture treated gods, it was on the works of men, and God, you know,
Yep.
their gods weren't really involved, whereas the Jewish people had sort of a personal God, and
Yep.
it was
Yep.
it was an entirely alien culture to them. They were very tight knit compared to everyone else, and so, you know, there's a lot of idiosyncrasies that the Jewish people had, which the rest of the world didn't have at that time, and it really came out through the Magi's perspective. I thought that was very
Right.
interesting.
Well, that was one of the driving questions that caused me to write the story was, why would these pagans care about the king of the Jews?
Yeah.
You know, because the Jews were looking down the line of salvation history. I mean, we stand here as Judeo-Christians, we can see how important the Jews were. As Jesus himself said, salvation comes from the Jews.
Yeah.
They're essential. But looking from a worldly perspective, the perspective of, you know, power politics or big empires of that time or this, the Jews would have seen a very minor people, you know, scattered and diminished.
Right.
They had no king. Who cares? I mean, it's just like being like caring about who's the mayor of Thousand Oaks or something like that. You know, it's like, you know, but who would care? Why would it matter to them? And so that was one of the driving questions I had to answer, because if these magi got on the road for this lengthy journey, something had to drive them. And why would they come? Why would pagans come seeking the king of the Jews? Why would they even care? Why would it matter? I mean, go to the temple of Zeus in Rome, go to the temple of Diana in Ephesus, but the king of the Jews? What difference does that make? So that was a question I tried to address in the story and come up with a reasonable rationale for why it became so important for them to seek the king of the Jews.
So, well, you know, a layman, you know, I'll just represent the layman's version. They'll say, well, a star guided them. They're just following a star. They're astronomers, right? So they saw something in the sky, and they're like, okay, let's go over here. Is that how it goes in the book?
But something like that. They see something in the heavens, and again, I draw on some research. I note this in the notes at the beginning of the book. There was an amateur astronomer by the name of Rick Larson, who did some very interesting research with star mapping software that they have these days, and you can run it on your computer, and you can put yourself anywhere on the face of the earth, anywhere in time, and see what the stars look like overhead. And he did some compelling research. And if you go to, there's a website, bethlehemstar.com, and you can get a video for $10, which is very interesting. And he explains all his research. And he explains what the heavens would have been doing. And it makes a compelling case. And nobody really knows, of course, but he makes a compelling case. And I drew on that, but that's only a starting point, because astrologers looking at the heavens and saying, oh, there's interesting stuff going on up there, it still doesn't answer why they would have gotten on their mounts and rode 700 miles to get to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That how far they went. Other scholars who've done more scholarly research into this say, well, it really wasn't from Persia, and it really wasn't all that far, and all that kind of thing. We can talk about that later. But given the framework of the story that I'm writing, what would have impelled them to make that journey? It would have been more than just seeing astrological phenomenon. There would have been more to it. And here I draw on the fact that the prophet Daniel, the great prophet Daniel of the Bible, he lived his life in Babylon and Persia. He, in fact, died in Persia. And he was given he was one of the few Jewish prophets that were given prophecies and visions that went beyond the immediate interests of the Israelites. His visions, if you read his book, they're very apocalyptic, they're very strange, highly symbolic, hard to understand. But they entail pagan nations, prophecies about the rise and fall of empires. And that all happened in Persia or in Babylon. So that's what I draw upon to tie that together. It's like more than just the stars in the heavens. these scholars also study the works of the prophet Daniel, or Belteshazzar, he would have been known in the East,
Mm,
and his works. And those things together convince them that something momentous is happening, and they need to go investigate.
I see. Okay. So it seems like you've done a lot of. I mean, you're so well read. So it seems like you might have perhaps come across some of this research naturally. Was there anything before writing the book where you said to yourself, okay, I need to research this specifically and I need to get this hashed out?
There were a lot of things that I touched up on. I went back and researched. Of course, I kept the scriptures right nearby to make sure I was, reflecting the story such as it is, accurately, and accounting for little details like it's been a mystery to many why there seems to be a contradiction between St. Luke's account and St. Matthew's account about the fact that St. Matthew records the flight to Egypt and St. Luke never does. He just, in the second chapter is the Nativity, and it's the visit of the Magi don't even visit in Luke's gospel. They just go to the temple for the purification and then go back to Nazareth. Only St. Matthew records the fact that, well, there was this little detour down to Egypt in there. And again, this is how one difference between historical writers of other times and our times. We like our history in nice, tidy, sequential packages. If we'd want to reconcile that. Okay, what's going on here? Did they go straight back to Nazareth, or did they go to Egypt, or what's the story? We'd want that all straightened out. Ancient historical writers didn't care so much about that as long as they got the relevant facts in there. And the Holy Spirit was leading St. Matthew to write things that were relevant to his account, and St. Luke to write things that were relevant to his. So I kept those close. I studied ancient Near Eastern cultures, particularly filling in details to try and give some accuracy to like the pagan temples and their practices and things like that. Because, we may think of religion as being something pristine and holy and moral, but you learn a little bit about those pagan cultures and some of the things that went on in those temples, and that was pretty brutal. It was pretty ugly stuff.
Okay. So, aside from the, so one of the other considerations, particularly with this, kind of as a part of historical fiction, like we don't want, some people might be sensitive where it's like, well, I don't want you to impose your image of the nativity story on mine. I have my own image of the nativity story. What would you say to that?
Well, what you're getting there basically is the imposition of a romantic and sentimental idea over the plain fact that this was a historical event. The Nativity was a historical event. Everything around it was a historical event. The birth of St. John the Baptist, the visitation, the flight to Egypt, all these things actually happened. And unfortunately, and this is true of the Magi too, we've kind of wrapped them in this kind of sentimental cocoon that makes us feel comfortable. And we like it. But that's not the purpose. The purpose of the historical accounts is to convey the centrality of the incarnation. God became man, and he came into our midst. And, it may surprise a lot of people, but for much of Christian history, Christmas was a minor holiday. It was celebrated. It was Christ's Mass, and you had Advent leading up, and then you had the festival afterwards. But Easter, Lent, Easter, and the Easter season were far bigger than Christmas is in the Christian calendar. And so, but we get attached to our sentiments, and there's nothing wrong with sentiment. I like to be sentimental myself. I like certain things, Christmas time especially, sentimental time. But we can't let that interfere with our attempt to understand the real message of Christ becoming, coming to our midst. Right now, I'm reading an excellent book. A friend of mine got it. It's The Life of Christ by Bishop Fulton Sheen.
Oh, that's on my to-read list. That's a famous one.
Oh, excellent book. Can't recommend it too highly. And he does a magnificent job of driving home the point that, set aside all the sentiments and all the fluffy figures and all that stuff. Christ came to die. He came to die for us. And that has profound implications. And if we ever get to the point where we're letting our sentiment interfere with our grasping the important thing, like Advent, we're in Advent now. The main thing Advent is supposed to do is confront us with the fact that we need a savior. We needed God to abandon his high position and the second person of the Trinity come down and assume human form. We take it for granted. Attitude largely these days is like, well, sure, we're such great folk. Why wouldn't God want to come down and hang around with us? What else we got better to do? And I like Lewis's C.S. Lewis's comment in Mere Christianity. He's trying to convey what it meant for the second person of the Trinity to take on human flesh, to become a human. He said, imagine becoming a slug or a crab, and you'll get somewhat a dim idea of what it meant for the Godhead to abandon his position. Like it says in, I believe, Philippians, St. Paul says, though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he emptied himself. And that's something we need to be reminded of. The emptying, the humiliation of God to come and be born. And that's one thing I try and convey in the Magi story, because it's not just about the Magi. I try and convey the entire nativity scenario, everything from John the Baptist and the Annunciation and all that. But I try and convey it in such a way that people can look at it with new eyes, to kind of set aside the sentimental accretions of the years and actually look at it as it had happened. Because it was a terribly humiliating thing to not, St. Mary didn't have a chance to even say where she could have her baby. Every woman has the right to have that. Yeah. It's a basic right of a woman to be able to say, I'd like to have my baby in humane conditions. And nope, Lord didn't allow that. Had to be born in a barn.
Okay, gosh, 50 things to jump on there. Okay, first off, coincidentally, I'm also reading Fulton Sheen. I'm reading Way to Inner Peace by him. As good as a speaker he is a better writer. I can't believe how good he writes. I'm sort of reading with a pen now and sort of circling all the quotes that I can post on the internet, and he is jam-packed. Oh my goodness.
Sheen was a genius.
He was. It's unbelievable. It's one of the most underrated. More people need to just talk about him. So there was that. There were a couple other things, and you touched on so much. Okay, anyhow. Okay, so we're talking about Longenecker. He had an interesting tweet. He also talked about some other thing. He plugged your book. He's From Afar. He says, From Afar is expertly written, carefully crafted, and fast-moving. I enjoyed the plot points, and I enjoyed the plot points that showed how the Magi's gifts were attained and linked them with the symbolism of king, priest, and suffering servant. Battle scenes and strategy sessions heightened the action of the book, and the final meaning in Bethlehem was tender, majestic, and moving, just as it should be. I have to agree with all of his sentiments, and I have to say personally, again, I've talked about historical fiction and my reservations. I've talked about, worrying about imposition of, this person's, personal view of the nativity scene. My personal opinion of From Afar is it's going to heighten your appreciation and understanding of the nativity story. I got teary at the end. I'm a man, but I'm not afraid to say that. It's funny because there's so much action in the whole thing, and then it's when things calm down that is the climactic moment, and it's really I'm getting choked up already just thinking about it. But okay.
But I must admit that was the biggest challenge of the book, was how to convey the meeting of the Holy Family without getting, kind of cloying and sentimental, but realizing this would be a powerful moment.
Yeah.
You know, the Magi, whoever they were, wherever they came from, ultimately came because God called them. And they've been recognized throughout history as the first acknowledgement by the Gentiles, by the nations, of the true king. So they had the first stab at it. And yeah, I write adventure stories, and you know, they're the battles and the assassinations and the intrigue and all that kind of thing. But I tried to portray that realistically, reflective of the times. But the really touchy point was getting to the Holy Family. How do you convey the Holy Family in their humanity? Because we can fall into two errors. We can either make them just, you know, so sugary that their feet don't even touch the ground, you know, and they're not real people. They're just these paintings on the wall or whatever.
Yeah.
Or you can go the other way and just discard the fact that this is the Holy Family we're talking about. Just say they're just ordinary Joes, you know. Well, they weren't ordinary. They were special. The Blessed Mother was special. St. Joseph was special.
Yeah.
Even, you know, Elizabeth and Zechariah, they were all special. And they had a special point in salvation history. But nonetheless, they were human. You know, they actually did. Their feet did touch the ground. They had to wash their clothes and cook dinner and all the other things that people always do. Yeah. To convey that, the humanity, but at the same time, the pivotal point in history. You know, the Magi were at the center. They were standing there at the very center of history, where the incarnation. They had a piece of that action, and how to convey it. That was the real challenge of that book.
Yeah, well, I think that particular scene is testament to how good of a writer you are. To me, you know, because so much of your book is just plot driven. You know, it's very fast paced, page turner type stuff. But then, you know, you're able to slow down, and then you're able to come out with something. I mean, to me, that scene is your masterpiece so far. To be honest.
Well, yeah. Hopefully there'll be more of them.
Hopefully more. Yeah. Hopefully it's just the beginning. Yes. Okay. So yeah, we're going to be doing a book giveaway from Afar. Starting today on Monday, and it will end on Friday. We'll give you the link and the details on how to sign up for that giveaway. Another book that I'm just gonna give a shout out to, Mystery of the Magi by Father Dwight Longenecker. The guy, yes. He's got his own Magi book.
That's right.
So we're selling that at tumblerhouse.com. I hope to do another giveaway. We're gonna be doing a giveaway a week, a new book each week now from now on. So everyone's gonna want to stay up to date. I want to give away some Mystery of the Magi in the upcoming weeks for the Christmas season. That's a book worth investigating. Everyone obviously loves Father Dwight. He's one of the most outspoken priests, and more priests need to be like Father Dwight, to be honest. I think if there are more priests like Father Dwight, we wouldn't be in such bad shape.